Good morning. I'm Dusky, President of ITC Midwest. For the third straight year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and extraordinarily proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As an electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is invested in and has a very real stake in the future of Iowa. We've supported this conference since its inception because we embrace its mission of gathering hundreds of Iowans together to explore the key questions and the big ideas that will shape the future of our state. ITC Midwest was formed in 2007 to improve electric transmission reliability and increase transmission system capacity in Iowa. And we followed through on that commitment with more than $4.1 billion in capital investments to date. Our investments in the system not only serve the changing needs of customers, they also provide additional capacities to support economic growth and development of low-cost renewable energy resources. Our investments have resulted in a 62% drop in transmission-related outages since ITC acquired the system and began operating it. From extreme weather events such as last year's derecho to the unprecedented transition to renewable energy, from the rapid adoption of electric vehicles to the increasing focus on energy system resilience, the electric utility industry is suddenly in the national spotlight. All of these forces reinforce the critical role of the transmission grid to support the changing landscape and ensure consumers have access to low-cost, clean, and reliable electricity. You know, we often talk about here at ITC about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There's also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your mind to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place now and in the future. I want to thank you for your participation to help shape the future and wish you a great conference.
Well, welcome everybody to Building the Grid, our panel called Building the Grid. This is, if you're following along, this is on the energy and environment track. If for some reason you ended up meant to go to some other panel but got here by mistake, feel free to stay with us. This is not quite like getting on the wrong plane at the airport. We're not going to take you to Pittsburgh when you really wanted to go to Laguna Beach. I think you'll find this is a very interesting topic. And so let me jump right into it. We have a lot to unpack today. We definitely have some panelists here who are in prime position to help us do that. So let me introduce our panel. And let me see if I can do that in the order that everybody is appearing on, at least on my screen. John Boston is the Director of Engineering at Alliant Energy. A lot of people got to know John through the derecho. But he and his team have been working on a wide range of things to electric generation, gas generation, electric distribution that helps them meet their strategy. So welcome, John, today. We also have with us J Jacobson, who's a professor at Iowa State University. And among the many things that he does is he directs the Center for Cybersecurity Innovation and Outreach at the university. And he and his team have been conducting all kinds of, in that role, have been conducting all kinds of risk assessments about something that's very common to businesses and utilities these days, which is cyber attacks and cybersecurity. And we also have with us Dusky Terry, who's president of transmission for ITC Midwest. The overall ITC holdings, Doug, you'll have to make sure I have this right. You have transmission lines in Michigan, besides Iowa, in Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma. And are things up and running yet in Wisconsin? I know they're underway.
That's correct.
Yeah. So, welcome panelists, and let me get this started. we have, like I say, a lot to unpack, but let's get this started today by kind of talking about one of the common denominators that I think is it's so much the concern these days among all businesses, which is cybersecurity, and especially in the grid. And it underscores everything I think that everybody's doing. I know here at the Gazette, we are attacked day in and day out, and we're just a little old newspaper. Imagine if we're something as vital as, well, I think we're vital, but as vital as electric transmission and distribution. So Doug, I wonder if you could just get us kicked off here a little bit, talking about what you and your team have been up to and what you're doing with the creating the grid and trying to figure out how to secure the transmission and distribution that we have.
Yeah. So, obviously here at Iowa State, we're a research and education entity. So we kind of come at securing the grid and everything else from a couple fronts. We have a strong research effort in securing the grid. We actually have a really cool test bed, a power cyber test bed, where we can emulate the grid using a real-time power simulator. We actually have real equipment connected to that, relays, et cetera, that let us mimic parts of the grid. And with that, we can play, we can do research. So we can look at vulnerabilities. We can look at different types of attacks. The team has actually found vulnerabilities in real equipment and submitted that to the vendors. So we're kind of doing the cutting edge of finding out when there's something wrong with the systems that can control the grid. But a big part of cybersecurity is preparedness, being ready for when something bad happens. In the grid, forever the grid's always worried about things like, although I don't think anybody was ever prepared for the derecho, but events like that, we need to do the same type of preparation in cybersecurity. And a lot of organizations do that. We use this same power cyber test bed to do various types of training exercises, whether they're local to a particular utility, doing the various what ifs. What if somebody took down part of your grid? How do you respond? And response is all the way through people on the ground to try to get power back, all the way up through the C-suite on how to respond and how to calm the public when the lights are all out. And then we do exercises that are more training based. So bringing in operators and having them walk through various scenarios. We also work with the state of Iowa and helping them with some of the statewide disaster exercises, tabletops, and how do we introduce cyber into that. So we're working pretty hard as to how to integrate cyber into everything that happens in the grid. I know our Mid-American and Alliant and other utilities do a great job of securing the grid, but it's something that we need to constantly be training, exercising, being prepared for the cyber equivalent of the derecho.
I was going to ask you about that point, about how does this intersect with the real world, with the Alliance and the Mid-Americans and the ITCs? You've got this test grid that you're setting up, and I assume you're going through simulations where you're trying to attack it and see what happens and how vulnerable things are. How does that integrate with the real world? I mean, do utilities send people in for training? Do you have outreach programs, or how do you connect between what's going on in the academic world and what's going on in the quote unquote real world?
Yeah, we do all the above. So we will have people who come to site and do training. We have the test bed can be remotely accessed, so we can take the test bed on site and work with organizations. And a little bit depends on whether training is where we're trying to provide the operators, provide the utilities the ability to sort of play the game, and learn about specific tools, techniques, et cetera. An exercise is where we walk through a disaster. And so allowing organizations to walk through an attack against the grid and looking at how they respond. So we'll work they'll either come here or, as I said, we've remotely gone to organizations.
I want to get into this topic a little bit more later on about the diversification of power generation. But we now have, not only, coal-fired power plants of old, but we also have solar and wind, and there's been a dramatic change in how power is generated, especially in Iowa, over the last several years. How does that affect, or does that affect cybersecurity when you have more providers? Does that cause more access points where something could go wrong?
Well, yeah, anytime you put something on the internet in one form or another, you've created another potential threat point. And when you start talking about, the various, micro generation or home generation, their potential, it's unclear how much that actually propagates back into the large grid, but it can potentially disrupt a home, disrupt a small region. In some cases, because the homeowner may or may not do the level of cybersecurity necessary. Somebody stands up a solar array and puts the control system on the internet, and so they can watch their solar panels from the comfort of their office, and they haven't set it up right. They potentially have opened themselves up. That typically doesn't go beyond themselves. And now if somebody were to find a vulnerability in all of the solar systems and manage to, common vulnerability, then you start having concerns about taking them all offline and what that would do to the distribution. But so yeah, anytime, the more things you put on the internet, the more targets there are.
Yeah, the internet the more that we have the internet of things, the more vulnerable we seem to be.
Internet of targets, yeah.
Yeah, the internet of targets. Somebody sitting in a basement can do a lot of damage. Dusky, on that point about the diversification of power generation, I think Iowa now is number one in terms of wind power generation in the country. You've seen we've all seen, I think, a huge change in where power comes from in the first place. Could you walk us through that a little bit in terms of what that means to a company like ITC that's trying to transmit all this power? Does it affect who's on the grid, who's not on the grid, and how reliable of a source it is? You must be thinking of all those things in the role you're in. I just wonder if you could walk us through that a little bit in terms of the changing dynamic of where power comes from in the first place and the challenges that creates.
Yeah, Craig, I'd be happy to. And you touched on two really key issues, and yes, I think about those every day.
Yeah.
Because there are two issues that are primary drivers in our business. First, cybersecurity you mentioned, and then the second is the shift in generation resource. And before I get into that, just a little bit of background. You kind of introduced ITC. A little more background. ITC Midwest was formed back in 2007 when we purchased the transmission assets from Alliant Energy, and primarily here in Iowa, a little bit into southern Minnesota, Illinois, and a touch into Missouri. And we've invested a lot of resources into that system, really to improve reliability and bring back a stable grid. And today we operate about 6,600 miles of transmission across those states. And there are key factors that are really driving the change and the need for a more modernized grid today. And one of them is that massive shift to renewables. We've seen the old kind of base load generation model of fossil fuel plants transition over to more of a distributed model of renewable resources, primarily wind, and now we're seeing emergence of solar. And if you think about the transmission system, that change, that transmission really drives the need for a new transmission system, because the role that transmission plays is it connects that generation resource with load. And so when you're going from a handful of central station power plants to distributed wind farms across the state, it really requires a different grid or a different transmission system. So that's driving a lot of the change. You talked about cybersecurity. If you look across the industry, that is typically either the number one or number two risk identified in the utility industry today. The cyber criminals are becoming much more sophisticated. They're finding new ways to access the system. And so we always have to stay one step ahead of them to make sure that we're protecting our assets and protecting the grid. And that's a real challenge. And another driver for why we need to modernize the grid to meet the challenges of tomorrow. A couple other factors, which I hope we kind of get into to discussion here today. Certainly, extreme weather events are driving need for investment in the grid. We can talk about the Iowa derecho and the experience we had last year. Significant damage to the system statewide, and of course, it's an aging system. It's one that it was built decades ago and constantly needs to be reinvested in and updated. And so that's where our focus has been, to make sure that we can continue to meet the needs of our customers going forward.
Thank you very much. I do want to remind, or as you say, for the first time, that questions from the audience are very welcome. We have a couple of them coming in already, but feel free to submit questions, and I'll probably sprinkle those in the conversation here as we go along here. There has been like you said, there's been a dramatic change in the share where energy comes from, and how it's generated in the first place, which has created challenges, obviously, to get transmission. But there's also increasing demand for electric. Part of it is there's a demand for the change in the way we generate it, but I think the one thing that's going to be for certain is that the demand for power, period, is going to continue to rise. And part of that is because of policy, and part of it is just population, and more things are based on electric cars and everything else. I guess when you talk about modernizing the grid, the transmission part of it, are you talking about, I wonder if you could put a little finer point on what it means to modernize it. Does that mean more of it, more the same, different materials, different kind of transmission? Kind of what does modernize mean?
So what we have today is a reliable transmission system that's really at capacity. And what we need for tomorrow to make sure that we're meeting tomorrow's needs is more capacity, more reliable, and more resilient grid that can withstand those extreme weather events better, that can make sure that it's secure from those cyber criminals that are trying to access it and bring down the grid, and make sure that we can meet the continuing transition towards lower cost renewable energy and bring as many of those on as possible. ITC Midwest was involved in the construction of multiple MISO multi-value projects that were approved back in 2011. And these are projects that were designed to provide that capacity needed for the energy transition towards renewables. We're currently in the process of building MVP 5 up in Northeast Iowa, Southwest Wisconsin. And when that goes into service in 2023, it will be fully subscribed. We have 58 generators that are waiting to connect to the grid. 55 of those are renewable, waiting for us to get that line built and in service so they can connect that new generation of the grid. And once that's fully subscribed, we need to be thinking about where's the next line of capacity going to come from. And that's what MISO's working on now with their long-range transmission plan. So it's really, modernizing the grid is really about building resilience into the grid, securing it, and providing the capacity for the future growth.
So let's say I'm a homeowner and I decide I want to put a solar array on my roof. has that reached a level yet where it's impacting the grid? Or how does that impact what you're doing in terms of connecting the grid? Is it still to the point where, hey, that's for individual use and it'll help your house, or is it enough people are doing it, enough businesses are doing it now that we want to upload that to the grid in some way, shape, or form?
So Craig, if I could jump in here real quick.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Because a lot of the impacts from the rooftop solar impact the distribution side of things, sometimes more so than the transmission side. So if you think about individuals putting more and more rooftop solar in, other individuals are putting chargers in for their new electric vehicles. They're changing out their natural gas appliances and put it in electrified appliances. That puts a lot of strain on the distribution system. And so our traditional design has been kind of a one-way flow. We make the power, we ship it out to the houses. Well, now we have to kind of integrate a new type of design that allows two-way flow more easily. We're transitioning from a lower voltage to a higher voltage, like a 12.5 distribution system to a 24.9 or 25,000 volt system to help create more capacity in areas where we don't always have a perfect understanding or knowledge where we're going to have increased demand. And that might also mean upping our transformer sizes to be more flexible to allow for more capacity. So when we do see that electrification occurring, and also people producing more from the rooftop, we allow that two-way flow from both the supply side and the demand side. So I just want to touch on that because it's a lot of times it can impact the transmission side, but a lot of that challenge is on the distribution side of things. So.
Yeah, I've gotten a couple of questions forwarded here having to do with energy storage, which is a key component, obviously, of renewable energy. Dusky or John, I don't know, maybe both of you want to address that a little bit in terms of what's going on in terms of where we stand on or where we're headed in terms of storing energy, renewable energy, so that we don't end up in some kind of a situation where all of a sudden we need power and we don't have it.
So I can talk about it from the distribution side and would invite Dusky to talk about it from the transmission side. But we've got several battery sites right now that we consider pilots. We're still trying to learn their capabilities and functionalities. A couple of the batteries that we've installed is really to address the question you asked earlier about, is there so much solar that is starting to impact your distribution system? Well, the answer is yes. And so what we're trying to do with a couple of these batteries is put them onto our system to allow more what we call hosting capacity, allow more rooftop solar, and when there's excess energy to store that and then release it later on when there's less of that generation being made. I do think though, as we decrease our reliance on fossil fuel and we have more renewable sources, we're going to have to find a way to incorporate storage systems where we're trying to account for the fact that it's not always sunshine's not always out or the wind's always blowing. So we have to have a storage system and long-term plan to accommodate those situations so that we maintain a really high level of reliability for our customers.
Dusky, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just add, I think, John kind of hit on it. In terms of energy storage, it's still kind of in the pilot phase right now. There are some commercial applications as the technology's improved and the costs have come down. I think it's a solution that's coming. Where its appropriate application is within the industry is still trying to sort that out and figure that out. The one thing I would add is, while storage may be a temporary fix to a transmission issue, it's not a replacement of transmission. If you think about batteries, it's carrying electricity over time. It's not necessarily carrying it geographically, and that's really the role of transmission. And so it may serve as a temporary solution or delay, a transmission upgrade for a period of time, but it's not a long-term replacement for transmission itself.
I think that maybe people are asking this question obviously because it's current in the renewable energy, but I think a lot of people are also looking in the rearview mirror at Texas and saying, "Oh God, we don't want that to happen here." And is there? I hate to ask questions about that could never happen here, but there's some key differences between what Texas does and what Iowa does in terms of transmission and distribution. I just wonder if you might be able to talk about that a little bit, so we're not looking at that and saying, "Oh my God, that's our future."
Yeah, I can start. First of all, we're not an island here in Iowa like Texas is. We're a part of the Mid-Continent ISO, Independent System Operator, MISO. And so we're part of a broader region that is the grid. And we rely on our neighbors to help us in times when either generation is short or transmission capacity is limited for whatever reason. And we came close during that cold snap here in the MISO Central region, but did not actually have any blackouts or rolling blackouts in the MISO region because of that regional nature of how we plan the transmission system and how we move generation through the grid to load. And so we're in a better position. Can we be better? Yes. And do we need to be preparing for the next extreme weather event? Absolutely. But I think that's what utilities are doing every day to make sure that we're better prepared.
When you talk about modernizing the grid and modernizing distribution as well, it seems pretty obvious that, like a lot of things, it's going to cost more, right? I mean, I assume that besides the demand going up, we're probably going to be facing more costs, but because you have to worry about cybersecurity constantly, and it's getting more sophisticated. You have to worry about climate change, natural disasters impacting our power system. Is that the one certain that we have? Is that we should all be prepared that we're going to have to pay more for this at some point, or increasingly pay more for it, I guess?
So a lot of what we do is balancing cost and risk in the utility industry. I mean, we can build a nearly 100% reliable electric system, but the question is at what cost, and at what cost are consumers willing to pay and able to pay? And so we try and balance what's the appropriate cost and the appropriate risk for us in terms of being vulnerable to extreme weather events, cyber security, things like that. And so if we want a more resilient grid, if we want to make sure that we can withstand another derecho better than we did last year, and withstand those cold weather snaps that we experienced across the country, then yeah, we're going to have to pay for it. And I think if you look at it from the consumer standpoint, you get greater reliability, enhanced resiliency. You also get access to the lower cost generation like wind energy and solar energy by connecting those lower cost sources of generation. You're making a more efficient grid and a more efficient utility system that serves them. And so it is in the benefit of the consumer to invest in the transmission system. They get that value out of it on the back end.
I guess I'd like to add on just a little bit on the distribution side. Part of what we consider modernizing our grid is not only going to a 25 kV system, which will allow us to retire some of our older substations, but the other thing we're doing is burying a lot of our distribution system. So in many cases, the cost of that is somewhat, can be a little bit higher than going overhead. But when you think about the advantages of not having to trim trees, not having cars hit your poles, not having wildlife get into your overhead lines, that kind of thing, there's some real long-term benefits to our customers. So I think, yeah, in some cases we're spending some additional money, but I think if you look at the life cycle of the assets we're investing in, it will provide a lot of value to our customers long-term.
I was going to ask a little bit about kind of lessons learned from the derecho. Looking back in the rearview mirror, we're looking at Texas, we're looking at the derecho, and nobody wants to relive the derecho. At least I don't. I've had enough of it. but obviously there were some lessons that everybody has learned from that. And one lessons that consumers have learned is that, we all take power for granted. You turn on the light switch and you assume the light's going to go on. And when it doesn't go on for a week, then all of a sudden it's a big problem. But so I wanted to talk a little bit about lessons learned from the trade show in terms of what's learned there that really fits into this whole concept of modernizing the grid. And is there something to be taken from that bad experience that we can mold into the future? But I'll ask you, Doug, John, since you brought it up, a question you probably have been asked a gazillion times after the trade show, which is, why don't you just bury the power lines? So do you want to talk about why that's not quite so simple?
Sure. So, we're definitely working towards burying all of our lines, but we've got approximately 17,000 miles of line out there, and to try to bury it all in a few years is not realistic. It would cost our customers too much money. So we've got a really good systematic way that we're looking at our existing system and looking at areas where we think it needs to be replaced, more from a end of life perspective. So we look at things like reliability, customer complaints, age, and we pinpoint those areas to kind of strategically underground our system. So it may not occur as fast as some would like to bury, but the reality is we try to balance those investments with our customer costs so that we can continue to provide safe and and affordable energy.
And of course, in a built-up area like Cedar Rapids, it's certainly harder now after the fact, where essentially it's a lot of the city's built out already, to go back and redo that. And then on the transmission side, it's even more difficult. I assume, Dusky, even if you buried it on the distribution side, could bury everything. That's not quite the realistic scenario on the transmission side, I assume.
That's correct. It's much more difficult and much more expensive than distribution. And that's the primary reason why you don't see transmission lines underground. Real quick recap of the derecho. I know we don't like to relive it, but it is good to remind ourselves of what we lived through. ITC Midwest had 145 transmission lines, individual transmission lines that were down as a result of that one storm. And they covered 2,100 miles in 26 Iowa counties. It was the biggest, most widespread storm that we had experienced in the history of our company. And very proud of the response, the coordination, the joint coordination between Alliant Energy and ITC Midwest. John and I were at the State Emergency Operations Center together, working on a coordinated response to try and get electricity restored as quickly as possible to our customers. You asked about some of the lessons learned. That's something we've spent a lot of time on in the last year, making sure that we learn from the experience and better prepare for the next event. Just to give you a couple of examples, one is grid design. Our engineers are constantly updating our design criteria of the transmission system based on the experience in the field. And so, again, the most significant damage, most widespread damage this storm caused, we're learning from that. We're hardening the system. We're installing storm structures to withstand more higher winds and more intense conditions. Another example is supply chain. We used the previous storm to predict future requirements. And so all of our material inventories have been reviewed and updated to make sure that we've got the inventory on hand in case we hit another storm of this size. From an operations standpoint, we created a core team of 4 very experienced utility field supervisors during the derecho response, and that really helped facilitate an influx of 783 outside crews and provide that oversight to help rebuild the transmission system. That went really well, and so we're implementing that or adapting that into our plans going forward. And then the last thing I'll mention, and I mentioned this briefly, John and I were at the State Emergency Operations Center. I think that was a key part of the coordinated response, is having all of the major utilities, the Iowa Homeland Security Emergency Management, Governor's Office, Iowa Utilities Board, FEMA, Red Cross, everybody was represented there so that there was a coordinated response, not only on the utility side, but also on the humanitarian side to allocate those humanitarian needs, food, water, to areas where electricity wasn't going to be restored for a matter of days. And so I think that's another lesson learned is that communication and coordination is so important to getting a response out to those who need it first.
Did the, in terms of lessons learned from the derecho, has that impacted how you might look at designing the grid in any way, shape, or form? And specifically what I'm thinking about, and maybe this predates the derecho, it probably does, where we stand with like microgrids, because I know that's kind of one of the buzzwords that people talk about today is, subgrids that could be isolated and removed from the rest of the grid, presumably to be able to keep open things like grocery stores and gas stations and some other thing that might have a generator or solar power or something like that. Does that derecho inform that discussion in terms of the overall grid design? And if so, how does it do that?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mentioned the storm structures that we use, and those are designed to stop the cascade. If you have a significant storm move through an area, it can take down an entire line, 161 kV or 345 kV line, which we saw during the derecho. By putting storm structures across that line, you're basically breaking it up so the conductor will actually break before it will take down more storm structures. So it limits the damage and it expedites the power restoration process. So, that's one example of how we have improved the design of the transmission system in light of the derecho experience.
Do we have any of these so-called microgrids in place right now, or is it still in the research idea stage? I don't know if we have any right now.
So at Alliant Energy, we have a team that's looking at opportunities to pilot a microgrid. Right now, we haven't found it to be rather cost effective, as you might imagine. And I think there is another aspect of this is kind of on the regulatory side, is maybe there's a new tariff that we need to develop with that additional service, if you will. But I guess from a design perspective, your original question, it certainly reinforces our desire to bury everything because it kind of makes it not susceptible to the high winds that we experienced before.
When you did maybe you were doing this beforehand, but when you look at the physical raw materials you use to make the grid, the poles and the lines, is that changing in terms of the materials you use to be more resilient, or how do you make transmission and distribution more "quote unquote" resilient to adverse weather, other than redundancy, perhaps, or is there a different material that you use, different building technique, or is it redundancy?
I think it's both. So we build to a certain design class that's fairly beefy. No pole can withstand winds at a certain mile an hour, so you can't stormproof anything necessarily. But we do look for areas where we have higher concentrations of customers to look for opportunities to loop it or to bring in an additional source. So if you lose one source, you can backfeed it from a different direction and that kind of thing. So our team is constantly looking for opportunities to add flexibility and resiliency into our system, in addition to just the materials that we're using.
I would be remiss. Go ahead.
I'd just add, John's right. That applies to the transmission system as well. I mean, we replaced over 1,200 wind steel poles as a result of the derecho, and the majority of those were aged parts of our system, but some of them were recently rebuilt. I mean, that's how strong those winds were. But as we redesign those and replace that older system, like the 34.5 kV system that we purchased, we're building it at a higher design standard than what was originally in place. And so that is a part of the modernization and improvement of the grid.
Yeah, I was saying that I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about electric vehicles, because that's obviously a policy scenario that's coming down the pike. A lot of auto dealers are headed this direction, regardless of what the government does, it sounds like. And I would think that maybe for everybody, but especially I was going to ask this question of John, on the distribution side, I imagine that presents some challenges. And one of the big things about electric vehicles is one of the big questions is the conundrums is, well, how do we know if we have enough charging stations? So would they ever be as ubiquitous as gas stations? So you can feel freer to go on a trip and not just go to the store to get groceries or something, but actually, drive across the state or the country. The John or Dusky or whoever might be able to answer this is this a situation where it's like chicken and egg, which comes first, the chicken and the egg, or is it more of a build it and they will come situation? I mean, I just kind of wonder how you're approaching this on the assumption that we're going to see more electrical vehicles come down the pike here, from school buses to city buses to your main car in your house, and not just an extra smart car that you had to run errands with. But how are you approaching this in terms of a distribution and transmission side, knowing that the demand is probably going to go up, but also the geography is going to change probably?
It's very much a little bit of the chicken and egg challenge, to be honest. One of the things that we've done recently as a company is we joined a coalition started by Ameren Utilities, so that we're trying to build some coordinated efforts in the Midwest to identify some logical places to put charging stations along some of the more major highways, and so that we're not kind of butting heads with neighboring utilities in that respect. The other thing we're doing is we're using some of our information from our smart meters to better understand where our charging stations being placed, both at a residential level and commercial. And so as we use that information and use some analytics, we can try to predict where we'll see some additional charging stations being placed, and try to anticipate where we need to make investments to account for that added load as we go forward. But it is a challenge because we don't have that crystal ball. We don't know exactly where everything's going to be and at what rate. So that's something my team continues to evaluate going forward, and always looking for better ways to plan around that.
Yeah, at some point back in the history, when gasoline cars first came out, the same kind of challenge was faced on the gasoline stations, right? I mean, were there enough gas stations? And at some point, that became obvious. I assume the same thing is going to happen with charging stations at some point. But the question is, how do we ever get there?
I would just add on to what John said. I think he's right. It has been kind of a chicken or egg thing, but we know it's coming now because major car manufacturers have all announced plans to transition to an all-electric fleet over the next 15 years. And we also have, governmental entities and major corporations that are transitioning their fleets to meet decarbonization goals over to all electric. And so we know it's coming. It's just a matter of how do we prepare in the timing of when we prepare to provide the infrastructure to support that additional load that's going to be needed to charge those vehicles.
I have a question from an audience member here. Let me rephrase this a little bit here. We're talking about, modernizing the grid, making it more resilient. And at the same time, at the same track, we have communications and technology like broadband and internet that also is being advanced, being more modernized. What is the connection, or is there a connection between the two? I can't remember who it was that mentioned that, maybe it was Doug mentioned that if you can watch your solar panels from the office. And we have a lot more of that integration going on now where the internet and the power grid are much more connected maybe than they ever have been before, not only in the what I would call maybe the industrial side of things, but also just in the consumer side of it, where everybody seems to have smart doorbells that they can look at and all this kind of stuff. Is there any kind of relationship between where the customers are going in terms of communication and where all these broadband is going, internet is going, and the modernization of the grid? Do they connect together in some way, shape, or form?
I think they very much do. If you think about our grid getting more complex and more modernized, that leads to needing to have increased communications with system components. And so one of the things that we're doing is installing more fiber. So we've got our own fiber needs, we've got our own control needs. And as we build more interconnection points at our substations and other parts of our system, we try to use that fiber and build out to those different areas. And as we do that, we're looking for opportunities to potentially partner with communication companies to try to get increased communications out to various areas that may not have it right now. So that's kind of our vision, is to kind of leverage the work that we're already doing for our system and look for opportunities to build out further going forward.
I want to ask all three of our panelists a question in terms of, from your vantage point, everybody has a slightly different vantage point here. What do you see the biggest challenges going forward are in terms of modernizing the grid, the transmission, the security, the distribution? From your vantage point, what do you see as the top couple of challenges coming down the pike here? John, you want to start with that?
Who put me on the spot first?
Yeah.
I think a couple of things come to mind. Just the resources to implement this. As you might imagine, there's been supply chain issues. We've got limited contractor resources, limited budget money, trying to balance costs for our customers. So those are some of the challenges, and also evolving technology. So when you think you've identified the piece of equipment that works best for you, well, someone builds a better mousetrap, and so then you want to try that out. So it's kind of exciting future, but it's also uncertain, and it feels like we need to be flexible as we build out our modern grid, so to speak, and make sure that we don't get too tunnel vision on one technology and leave some flexibility to try other things out there. But those are some of the things that come to my mind when I think about modernizing the grid.
Dusky, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think, it starts with identifying the solution. So it's easy to identify the problem, right? In areas where we have limited or no capacity or congestion on the system. But then finding the projects that will solve that problem. And I mentioned that the MISO Long Range Transmission Plan, or LRTP, that's referred to. That's a very important study that's underway. That's doing just that, trying to identify across the MISO region what are the solutions to modernizing the grid. One of the challenges that they're running into, as you would expect, is cost allocation and figuring out how you allocate the costs of upgrading the grid to those who benefit. And so there's conversations underway, a lot of stakeholders involved in that. And I think they'll get that sorted out, but that's one of the challenges we've encountered. And then you also, the permitting process is kind of split between, particularly if it crosses state lines, between federal at times and then multiple states when you're trying to route these projects. That can be a challenge in coordinating the timing of a major project like that across different states. And then I would also point to, the impact to landowners is something that's a serious concern to ITC Midwest. Our relationship with the landowners we work with is very important to us. It's a long-term relationship. We know that our success in operating our transmission lines are tied to those landowner interests. And so we really strive to work well with landowners. And for the projects that we've put into service, we've been able to get a voluntary easement with 98% of our landowners, which we're pretty proud of. It really shows that we do everything we can to try and work with them and accommodate their needs, while also making sure that we got the infrastructure in place to deliver reliable electricity.
I want to ask Doug also to weigh on this, but before I do that, both John and Dusky, you bring up the question about landowners. It's interesting that if you drive around, say, Coggin, which is for people not familiar, that's a small city that's maybe about a half an hour north of Cedar Rapids. And there's signs everywhere that say no utility scale solar, and they're ubiquitous in all the throughout the, as soon as you get outside the city limits, are everywhere. How much of the future, as you see it, has to do with continuing the conversion to wind and solar? And do you, on the one hand, it seems like the public is very much in favor of renewable sources of energy. On the other hand, it's like, I don't want a transmission line in my backyard. How much of that keeps you up at night, worrying about, are we going to be able to modernize and expand this the way we need to, or do we run the risk of making some of these positive relationships that you've talked about go wrong?
So I think from our perspective, we have the same view as Dusky and ITC in terms of we really try hard to work with the individual landowners. We work out lease agreements with them, easement agreements with them. And so we really try hard to be partners with landowners, because obviously without access to land, there is no wind turbines, there is no solar fields. So I think the best that we can do is try to educate our communities in terms of the jobs that get created when we have new projects like this. The lease agreements that we reach with the landowners provides a nice steady income for those landowners. And so to me, it's really about establishing and maintaining a really good relationship with the communities and the landowners, trying to make sure that we're addressing their concerns the best we can along the way, whether it's through construction or in operation periods. So, and then, trying to make sure that our regulators are in tune with our approach, and obviously our partners with ITC and other stakeholders.
Thank you. Doug, and lastly, you, from your vantage point, what do you think the biggest challenges are in the next few years?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I think one is, as we're talking about it all day, we're pushing more of control, more, as far as local generation and the rooftop and the backyard. We're pushing more ability with smart meters to be able to manage, power allocation to a home, or measure power allocation. Every time we put those things in, those have a potential of being an attack point or an attack vector. And everybody's doing everything they can to secure things. But as we push things out to the homeowners, you could conceivably see attacks that go against the endpoint and beyond distribution, beyond transmission, and actually target the end user. Now, what benefit they have, we could argue about that, but could you envision ransomware that holds your power for ransom at your house? No, don't pay me, you don't get power turned back on. So again, as we distribute things and put more things, that's a threat. And we just have the standard threat of cybersecurity. As has been pointed out by the other two panelists. They're out there all the time. They're out there trying to cause all sorts of havoc, whether it be for money, which tends to be the current thing. But we're also, everybody's concerned about the threat of just some malicious actor whose goal is just shut the power off in Iowa in January 20th, which usually is about the coldest day, and what sort of effects that obviously would have. The good side is all the modernization that everybody's talking about is also looking at how we cyber harden the grid. John mentioned Alliant bearing all the basically building their own communication system to control the grid. Things like that are positive steps that the power companies are taking to make this more secure. But the keep you up at night things are somebody turning off my power in January 20th. And
that might not make that much of a strategic difference if it were a house, but it might if it were a hospital or a big business or an ethanol plant.
Or an entire city, or
right.
You can
might make a big, huge difference actually.
Yeah.
And following up on that question a little bit, and this might be tougher to answer. What could Iowans do? People who are listening to the panel right now, they want to go out and take some action or do something to help modernize the grid in some way, shape, or form. And I don't mean going out and putting up poles. But is there something that Iowans should do to take action on this topic of renewable energy, better distribution, better transmission, making life easier for all the consumers? Is there something that people could do or should do, or is it maybe it's as simple as picking up the phone and calling somebody? I don't know the answer to that question, but is there something that Iowans should, from your perspective, that Iowans should do?
Greg, I've got a couple of suggestions for you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dusky.
So to the extent that there's policymakers or regulators that have joined us today, my call to action for them would be, policy and regulatory certainty are important when it comes to action in the private sector, and private companies respond to that type of certainty, and it typically leads to better outcomes. And so when you're talking about regulation or policy that governs energy in the utility sector, having that certainty is really important for us long term, because we plan in decades and we invest capital based on that certainty. To the extent that there's utilities representatives that have joined us, we need to do a better job of articulating what the value of that investment in the transmission system is. The costs are known, and typically they show up on your bill as an itemized part of your utility bill, but we don't necessarily do a very good job of articulating the value of a modernized grid to the consumer. And so we as utilities need to do better at that. We also need to understand that the precedented storm, or the unprecedented storm that we experienced last year, is now precedented, and we need to be better prepared the next time that hits. And then finally, for consumers, as you mentioned, get engaged, understand your electric service, understand distribution, generation, transmission, the role of each. And if renewable energy is important, you understand that if you want renewable energy, you need transmission to deliver that. And there's reasons why the grid is designed the way it is, and a lot of that is to meet consumer demand. So that would be my call to action today.
Thank you very much. Unless somebody has anything to add, we're coming up to the end of our hour already. And I especially want to thank our panelists for taking time out of the busy day, as everybody has, to join us and answer some questions. And thank you very much. The Iowa Ideas continues. We still have another round of panels still today, and then it starts again tomorrow at 8:30. So it's free to register. So if obviously everybody here is already registered, but if you have a friend who might be interested, it's no cost to register. Tomorrow we have some big ideas seminars where we talk about some key issues, and people throw out spitball ideas on how to move forward on those ideas. And I think that would be very interesting to be part of. We also have Peggy Whitson, the Iowa-born astronaut. This is our closing keynote speaker. She was the first female commander of the International Space Station, is the American who holds the record for the longest person ever in space. And she's a rock star in the STEM world, STEM education world these days. And she's preparing to go up again, working for a private space company, preparing to go up to the International Space Station again. So that could be very interesting. And I'm told she also will talk about her favorite astronaut food, which I can't imagine there is any such a thing. Anyway, I want to thank our panelists for joining us. And I especially want to thank ITC Midwest for being our presenting sponsor here. It's because of the sponsorship and the interest in moving Iowa forward that because of our sponsors, we're able to make this free access for everybody, whether in Iowa or outside of Iowa. So thank you all very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of Iowa Ideas. And I might see some of you tomorrow morning in another panel I'm doing. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.